The speaking order is Francis.
Well, not too close to the edge.
We are on live now. We are.
It's the, if they mic you up, that's what it is.
Yes, yes. As some of,
Like,
yes, yes. As some of our former prime ministers have got into trouble when they
Hey
didn't
everybody,
realize.
good evening. I think we should get started. Thanks for your patience. My name is Mark Clifford. I'm the president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. I've had the pleasure of knowing Jimmy Lai for more than 3 decades now. And I was on the board of directors of Dex Digital, the publicly listed company that published Apple Daily before we were shut down by the government a few months after Jimmy was imprisoned. And that imprisonment was more than 1,100 days ago. So Jimmy has been in solitary confinement most of that time. I think many of you know that he's undergoing a lengthy national security law, I guess you could call it a trial, it's really a kangaroo court. You're here tonight to see a remarkable documentary of one of the most extraordinary people I've met. In fact, I'm just finishing a biography of Jimmy, which will be published by Simon & Schuster at the end of this year. It's part of, it's an objective book. I think it's not a hagiography, but it is part of the attempt to keep the spotlight on Jimmy and to work for his release. So we're very, very lucky tonight to have a pretty amazing panel and some good timing. My colleague Francis Hoy is the Policy and Advocacy Director based here in Washington, D.C. for the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation. Francis, just today, has released this report on religious freedom, or the lack thereof, in Hong Kong called Hostile Takeover, the CCP in Hong Kong's religious communities. Coincidentally or not, we have Benedict Rogers from Hong Kong Watch, who was, are you the principal author or very involved with a religious freedom report that came out in December last month? And Benedict is based in London and an old friend and colleague, and also, as with Francis, lived in Hong Kong for, well, not quite as long as Francis and me, I guess, but lived and cut his journalistic teeth in Hong Kong. Is now based in London and is here for a number of events, including testimony on Thursday for the Congressional Executive Committee on China, which is represented here by Pierre Totsi, who has worked for many years on religious freedom issues as a staff member to Representative Chris Smith, Republican of New Jersey, and now on the commission. So what we'll do is have each of the panelists make a few remarks, I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll go into the movie. We'll probably have this first part, we'll limit to 30 minutes. The movie is relatively short, but we don't want to keep you from the main event, which is the movie. So, Francis. Yep.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming. Many people come to me today and tell me about, Jimmy Lai and the situation of Hong Kong, and I'm just really grateful to talk to you guys and receive all the support. I'm just deeply grateful about that, and also I'm very grateful to speak alongside a full panel of amazing, knowledgeable people who are, again, very knowledgeable on the subject of religious freedom and human rights. So as Mark just said, the CFHK Foundation just published a 55-page long report on the religious freedom in Hong Kong. And the idea behind this came after I had many conversations with friends and people across religious communities in Hong Kong. And many of them have told me stories about how their religious lives have been affected under CCP's rule. But most of them are reluctant to share these stories mostly because of the the political situation with the national security law, all the chilling effects that was imposed in the society that makes them censor themselves. So a lot of them are very reluctant to share, and therefore we decided to use a report to highlight the witnesses' testimonies and kind of pave the way to show how religious freedom is deteriorating in Hong Kong and how CCP is basically taking over the religious sphere in Hong Kong. In the report, we highlighted 4 key warning signs. First, the sinicization of religion of the CCP. Second, the use of religious education to indoctrinate students. Third, the intimidation of clergy leading to self-censorship. And fourth, the direct attack on religion and faithful. We all know the situation in China, and on the surface, we see Hong Kong's situation is not as serious and severe as what's happening in China. But religious leaders in Hong Kong are being pressured to promote CCP's priorities. And China is tapping into the influence of these communities for its own political agenda. For example, the Muslim community in Hong Kong is politicized to rally support for CCP's development initiatives and also downplay China's human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. At churches, priests have received complaints about mentioning the government in their homilies. A Protestant pastor is actually sentenced to 13 months in jail under the national security law. Persons of faith are increasingly subject to legal prosecution, including names we are very familiar of, including Jimmy Lai, Cardinal Zen, and Joshua Wong, just to name a few. At school, the curricula of religious studies are now mixed with patriotic and socialist values. The PRC national flag that symbolizes atheism is raised and displayed next to sacred symbols, the cross, a depiction of Jesus Christ, or Islam flag. And students' textbooks on religious studies also contains prayers embracing China and the Chinese identity, all of which are very concerning signs. Now, the CCP is also pressing for the establishment of an oversight body in Hong Kong to control religion. They also seek to pass laws to criminalize and prohibit Falun Gong, that is considered a cult and extremist organization in the definition of Beijing. It's also likely that the Vatican would consider legalizing the state-controlled Catholic Church in China and the Bishops' Conference. And if that happens, Hong Kong clerics would then have to register to the Patriotic Association in China and to take oaths of fidelity to the government. So in conclusion, religious freedom is deteriorating in Hong Kong. The trends that we documented in our report are distinctly negative. So we call on the international community to acknowledge that and to stand against the systemic violation of religious freedom by the Hong Kong authorities and the CCP. At the end of the report, we included a number of actions that the US government, global religious leaders, and other democracies can take to safeguard the religious freedom in Hong Kong. And I'm happy to discuss that further when we have more time later. But I highly recommend everyone to grab a copy of the paper to understand better of the issue and also stay behind for the screening later. I think Jimmy Lai's story is a story of bravery, and a lot of the witnesses who contributed to this report is also showing their courage to speak up. One of the Catholic priests who contributed to the report told me, I'm just going to share a quote from him. He said, quote, "When there is injustice, we can't worry too much. We must speak out. Even if it leads to imprisonment or the closure of churches, we cannot compromise the truth." And I think this is a spirit that Jimmy Lai and a lot of the prisoners of conscience are embodied, and it kind of motivates them to step out and take to the streets and to speak up for truth and to defend for freedom and human rights. And I hope that, after watching the documentary on Jimmy Lai, seeing the report and to learn more about the stories from the witnesses that are highlighted and featured in the report, I hope you also can feel, their courage and feel more empowered as we keep, going forward and advance global religious freedom.
Yeah, thank you.
I think one important point to underscore is things are bad with religious freedom in Hong Kong, but we're at the early stages of what's likely to be a much more intense crackdown. Both of these reports talk about this. The CCP has a very clear playbook that they've used in many places. They're rolling it out in Hong Kong. Religion is one of the last kind of spaces of freedom. And of course, many people involved in the democracy movement are also prominent. Religion or faith is a very important part of who they are. I think the international community has a chance to slow down the juggernaut, the CCP juggernaut, and we have perhaps a new chance with the consultation for Article 23, which is the national security law legislation announced today, so we have a month. I think for the international community to do what it can to try to rally and again slow down the CCP, to raise the price. That's all we can do is to make it more costly for the CCP crackdown to continue. But unfortunately, we're at fortunately or unfortunately, we're at an early stage in I think a worrying process. And I think this is a good chance perhaps to turn it over to Benedict, who like Jimmy Lai is a Catholic convert, and like Francis, has just come out with a report. And so maybe you can pick up where Francis left off and tell us why we should be worried about Hong Kong and why it matters.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's a great privilege to be here. I want to thank everyone for coming and thank you for inviting me. And I want to really congratulate Francis and the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation on this really excellent report, which I think it's no coincidence that we now have these two reports within a few months of each other, because that shows that this is an issue that we all need to take seriously and that is emerging. I think I would say religious freedom in Hong Kong is the last freedom to go. Over the last few years, we've seen freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, association, press freedom, all dismantled completely. And now religious freedom is the next target in the CCP's lights. And I entirely endorse what Francis has said. I haven't had a chance to read the full report, but the 4 points that Francis outlined are exactly the points that are in the report, which we titled "Sell Out My Soul." There's I don't know if it's known in America, but there's an English Christian hymn, "Tell Out My Soul," and I was in church and heard this hymn and I thought, tell out my soul, which is what we should be doing when we have religious freedom. In Hong Kong, it's actually sell out my soul, because people are being forced to make compromises they should not be forced to make. Religious leaders are forced now to avoid preaching on certain topics, avoid preaching on themes of human rights or justice, and even anecdotally avoid preaching on certain passages of the Bible that are regarded as potentially provocative to the authorities. So I think this is a very important report. To answer the question, why should we be concerned about this and about Hong Kong as a whole and about Jimmy? Well, let me first of all say that, like Mark, I've had the privilege of knowing Jimmy for some years, met him multiple times. He's a friend and an extraordinary inspiration to me. He's the head of his international legal team, put it very well, talking about the charges that Jimmy is facing. And she said, in reality, although he's being accused of conspiracy to publish seditious materials and conspiracy to collude with foreign political forces, in reality, he's being charged with the crime of conspiracy to commit journalism, the crime of conspiracy to talk about politics with politicians, and the crime of conspiracy to talk about human rights with human rights organizations. And I think that sums up very well the absurdity, but also the gravity of his case. I think Hong Kong really matters for several reasons. Firstly, it has gone extraordinarily rapidly in the last few years from being one of Asia's most open, freest cities, which it was when I lived there for the first 5 years after the handover, and for some time after that, into one of the region's most repressive police states. Secondly, it is actually exporting, or the CCP is exporting that repression well beyond its borders in a particularly serious and shocking way, with the issuing of arrest warrants and bounties. And I know, Francis, you are one of a number who have experienced that, and I want to express my solidarity and my great respect for your courage in that. But in a less serious way, even people like myself have received various threats. I've received threatening letters through my letterbox at my home in London. Even my mother has received letters from Hong Kong telling her to tell her son to shut up. And I will shut up in a moment, but luckily my mother has a good sense of humour, and she took the view, she laughed, she said she'd given up many years ago trying to tell me to shut up. But if it's doing that, and I woke up on January the 2nd this year to find I'd been named in Jimmy's trial along with a number of other foreigners, including American citizens and British citizens, as so-called collaborators with him. So it is a threat to our freedoms in our own democratic societies here, as well as to its own people in Hong Kong. And that matters to the world because Hong Kong has been a major international trading and financial centre. When its freedoms, its rule of law, its transparency are undermined, that has not only moral implications, but also economic and security implications. And then finally, on why it should matter to us in this room, well, as you've heard, religious freedom is being dismantled in Hong Kong, being undermined in Hong Kong. And for many of us that care about religious freedom, and I assume that's why we're all here at the International Religious Freedom Summit, it matters because it was until recently the staging post for religious activity in mainland China. It was the place where Christians in China could come to have workshops, and not only Christians, other religious groups as well, to have workshops and trainings. It was a place where religious literature could be sent into China from, and all of that has disappeared. So to anyone who cares about religious freedom, this transformation of a free, open society into a repressive police state should matter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Benedict. I mean, just to underscore a couple of those points, the speed, the severity with which a free and open city has been transformed, as you say, into one of Asia's most repressive police state. I believe Hong Kong Watch, Hong Kong Democracy Council has calculated that Hong Kong has had a faster growth of political prisoners than anywhere other than Belarus and Burma, another place that Benedict has worked on. And also to underscore this extraterritoriality, Benedict makes light of this, but here's a man sitting in London, running a London-based organization, being threatened under the national security law if he doesn't shut down his website, which as far as I know is not in China. Here's my colleague Frances Boy, who wakes up to find a $1 million Hong Kong bounty if she's turned in and successfully prosecuted. And her Benedict, I don't think that's terminated in Hong Kong. This does. And the pressure that's put on people and the extent to which the CCP wants to export this way of doing politics worldwide, I think really should be frightening to all of us. We're lucky we have an ally, Kira Katsi, who is the staff director at the CECC, as I've mentioned. So maybe you can help us tie this together a little bit, Kira, and talk about your work in this regard.
Sure. And one thing is I'm sitting here, and I also want to underscore how brave Frances is too, and how much we all support her. But and I hope I'm not revealing too much, but the three of us are Catholic, and one way to look at what's going on in Hong Kong, it's an intra-Catholic dispute, because we have Cardinal Zen, who really is the conscience of democracy, and human rights in China. We have Jimmy Lai, who could have left. I mean, he's a rich man. And he's a mogul. You know, oftentimes, Hong Kong mogul Jimmy Lai, it seems to go with them, like Rosie Fingered Aurora, but he could have left, but he didn't. And if you are familiar with his writings and his prison diaries, really, it's a tremendous witness. He suffers, you know, for the sake of Hong Kong. Even older generation people like, you know, Martin Lee and Anson Chan, and even go back to Chris Patton, also Catholic. But on the other side, you have John Lee, you have Carrie Lam, they're also Catholic, too. And I think as you see, and I don't want to be too critical, but you also see within the Catholic Church this division, and I think you have to look at it in the larger context of the Sino-Vatican Agreement, and, you know, quo vadis, I mean, which way are we going to go here? And, you know, if I can speak very, very frankly, when you have a tremendous witness of St. John Paul, who understood communism, understood Nazism, understood totalitarianism, and St. John Paul, but and Pope Benedict, who spoke about the dictatorship of relativism in very, very clear terms. There is, I think, within the Catholic Church, you also have, you know, Bishop Stephen Chow, who went to Beijing, and who, I don't know if you want to use the term kowtow, but you know, a very much more compliant view towards there. So you have, I think, in many ways, you look at Hong Kong and you look at the broader picture of the Catholic Church, you have two distinct divisions. And I think one thing that motivates someone like Cardinal Zen or Jimmy Lai is a firm understanding that there's a natural law. There's a law above the law. So when you're protesting unjust laws, when you're saying this shall not stand, when Jimmy Lai is willing to sacrifice himself, and he is a martyr, you know, to the truth, to a higher law, just as Martin Luther King went to Birmingham jail, where he spoke about that natural law and justifying civil disobedience, because there's a law that's higher than that. I mean, I think, and we as Catholics, you know, do we really believe that? And is there, you know, do we adhere to that law? And there are some in very high positions in the church, I don't know if they really believe that. And that should shock us. Now, I just want to say from the Chinese perspective, you know, one thing that just gets me very annoyed is when people sort of equate Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party with Confucianism. No, not at all. They are legalists, Chinese legalists. They're not Confucians. And why is this important? Because just as there is a natural law idea in Western thought, analogous in Chinese thought, the Tao. There's a passage in Mencius, the great Chinese thinker, okay? If you juxtapose it with St. Thomas Aquinas, they're practically identical. Okay, and this is why the Chinese party fears authentic Catholicism and also fears authentic Confucianism. Mencius and St. Thomas Aquinas are both asked the question, is it ever justified to overthrow a government and depose an emperor or a king? Mencius is even asked, is regicide, the killing of that king, ever justified? And they both answer, no. But it is justified to overthrow a tyranny and to overthrow a tyrant. And that's why, if you look at Chinese history, oftentimes it was these Confucian scholars. They weren't religious believers, but to the point of martyrdom, to the point of being buried alive in some of the annals, because they challenged the emperor because of that. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas talks about a tyrant who does violence to the common good is no longer justified. He has violated the natural law. Mencius appeals to an even older tradition. He quotes from the Book of Documents, where he says, how do you tell, you know that an emperor is a tyrant? He's no longer an emperor, in fact. Because he He says that heaven sees with the eyes of the people and hears with the ears of the people. Okay? So a tyrant who oppresses the people, who does not rule according to the natural law, loses the mandate of heaven, the tianming. That's where that passage in Mencius is. That's where the mandate of heaven is discussed. We've, just as we see in Christianity, that tension, which we're seeing right now in Hong Kong, between do we adhere to the natural law, or do we cave, because of pressure of the state? The St. Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher did not apostatize, or did not, renounce their faith, and they suffered death for it. But most of the bishops of England did. Most of the people in high positions in office, they went along with the new regime. There's always that tension. It's the tension that we see in Hong Kong right now. One little note. So why is it that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party really fears this authentic adherence to the natural law, to the Tao? A few months back, Li Keqiang, who was a Chinese Communist Party official, okay, died somewhat prematurely. Some people say there were suspicious circumstances in which he died. I don't know if we could go so far, but it was an untimely death, and there was a lot of curiosity as to that. Do you know the last speech that he gave? Okay, the last speech that he gave echoed that passage from Mencius that was referring to the Book of James. He says that, heaven sees, heaven has eyes. They see what is going on. Even though he was a member of the Politburo, he was a communist, and we shouldn't, glorify him too much. He saw what was going on, and he challenged Xi Jinping, and that was a very, very direct challenge. So that's what the Chinese Communist Party fears. It fears people, whether within China, and they may not even be Christian or Catholic, but they have this idea of a law above the law, the Tao there, to which all, righteous conduct should conform. And so too do they fear people like Cardinal Zen and Jimmy Lai, who adhere to a law above the law, and whose lives are, give testament to that. So I just, I thought, just kind of sitting here, it's like, oh, we're all Catholic, and how does this all connect? But yeah, thanks.
Well, Pierre, I'm not going to let you off quite so easily. I know Edie wants to get the movie going, but let's get down to earthly law. I want to lead with something a little more positive. You at CECC have been actually working with us on some legislation. Can you just briefly tell people about that?
Yeah, so we've been working on a number of issues. One piece of legislation that I want to highlight is, so people may not know this, but just as China has embassies here in the U.S., you have three outposts of the Chinese Communist Party, is what I would call them, these Hong Kong economic and trade offices. And back in the day, they would try to cultivate good investment in Hong Kong, and that was wonderful. But what they've now become are really adjuncts of the CCP. They engage in transnational oppression. Some of Francis's colleagues have been harassed and stalked from these HKIDOs. They track Hong Kong nationals who are here. They also push Hong Kong propaganda. And so we've introduced this legislation that would authorize the president to shut down these HKIDOs, these Hong Kong economic and trade offices, and also prevent U.S. government entities from abetting Chinese propaganda efforts. A couple of years ago, the Smithsonian Institute, it was after COVID restrictions, did this jazzy nights with the Hong Kong economic and trade offices. It was to promote this idea that Hong Kong is back. Well, the Hong Kong that we once knew is dead. Okay, we still have, and Jimmy Lai's trial with the 3 judges, including with one foreign judge as well. They still wear the wigs. They still have the whole pomp and circumstances, but as Mark alluded to, they should really be wearing kangaroo suits, because it is a kangaroo court. But so anyway, this HKIDO bill would would, basically, call these Hong Kong Economic and Trade Offices out for what they are. And I want to give a shout out to Nina Shea, who's done some very good work on it. She's right there in the audience. So much important work on religious freedom around the globe, former USERF member. She had a very interesting column the other day and talking about renaming the street. She suggested from the Chinese embassy, Jimmy Lai Way. Not to be confused with Blue Jay Way, which was a Beatles song in that psychedelic period. I think I just want to clarify that for you. And we talked about it, so Nina and I were talking about it the other day, and it's like, well, why don't we, the Chinese embassy, we got Lil Chabot, we got other folks there, why don't we name the street in front of the HQ Jimmy Lai Way? And, so that's, I think, something that we're working on, so it's another piece of really inspired legislation. Thanks, Nina, it's going to get the staff, we got Scott Flipsy back there from our so Scott, we got to draft some legislation. And Mr. Smith, I think, intends to introduce it as well. But very excited about the HQ bill because I think it's one thing that it's already passed the House and it's now with the Senate. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee had marked up their version of the bill, so I think there's a glide path get the bill passed and onto the president's desk. So I think that's an important message that will be sent. So.
Well, thank
Thank you very much. And really wish we had more time because you're such extraordinary panelists, and there's so much to talk about, particularly because of the research that both of these organizations have done, as well as the legislation that Piero and others are working on. So please join me in giving them a round of applause, and then